Hello, beautiful community. Zoran Mamdani's victory reveals quite a few big picture takeaways about the temper of our political age, and we're going to focus on 6 of them together. There are a lot of micro takeaways that are hugely interesting. They're going to be beautifully delivered by other platforms, but we're going to go global, independently of whether you are in the United States and independently of whether you love Zoran or whether you disagree with some of his policies and some of his ideological positions. I've written us a very short Substack about this just to help us get through it quicker. So let's go for a beautiful community. Now, my first point is about fear and fearful defensive politics. Mamdani demonstrated what many politicians, many media organizations, many higher education institutions lack, and that is the absence of fear. The absence of fear is a very important political virtue. And in our age of democratic decline, it's an antidote to authoritarianism. Second point is just about democratic socialism. Mamdani's choice of democratic socialist over social democrat as a label proved not to be a very major liability. Because for him, and also for Bernie, democratic socialist versus social democrat is a distinction not of sense, but of sensibility. So when David Remnick recently asked Mamdani, what's the difference for you? He said, the difference is that I fight longer and harder for my political ideals than I would do if I were a social democrat. That's to say, analytically, we're not looking at anything other than social democracy. My third remark is about hyper-identity politics, or what's often called woke. Mamdani ran a progressive campaign that stayed largely non-woke. So woke means, number one, that you turn political disagreement into core moral conflict. Number two, that you turn moral conflict into conflict about identity. And three, you turn identity into something that institutions must enforce. And Mamdani largely avoided this spiral that has so unfortunately beset Western politics over the last decade. He argued passionately for his positions, but mostly didn't moralize his political opponents or strive to remove them from the table of politics. There's not a clean pass here, but there is a clean enough pass. My fourth point is about populism. There are two kinds of populism. Exclusionary populism, that's what Donald Trump does, and inclusive populism, that's what Bernie does. Now, inclusive populism doesn't mean that it's terrific populism and is exactly the sort of thing we need. It just means that if we're going to have populism, we'd better have inclusive populism because it lacks the huge fault of exclusionary populism, which is the politics of enemies that we're witnessing like water coming to the boil, unleashed into the American polity. Now, Mamdani is an inclusive populist, which means that for him, number one, everybody counts, and he knows that the politics of enemies is the enemy of democracy. And number two, he energizes himself and citizens by appealing to their better instincts, by appealing to their constructive rather than their destructive impulses. He's fueled by aspiration and hope, not by betrayal and resentment. And this business of us being in an age in which increasingly citizens are encouraged to liberate out their destructive impulses is something very important and perhaps worthy of a separate conversation. I was just thinking that ages ago, Peter Pomerantsev and I said that we'd do a little talk together. And actually, I think Peter would be very good at talking about this destructive stuff. So we might do that. It's important to not overshoot with this, because what you don't want to say is that it's the fault of citizens that our democracies are in decline because their destructive impulses have been liberated. What you want to say is their destructive impulses have been liberated because of various social forces. And it's those social forces we need to tackle in order to again inhibit the destructive impulses of our citizens and help out their constructive impulses, help their constructive impulses to come out. So Mamdani is an inclusive populist. My fifth remark is about radicalness. Because radicalness isn't a problem. It's the undoability of radical policies or policies that are said to be radical but actually might not be. That's the problem. So Mamdani promises not revolution but small public goods, partial rent freezes, free buses, fewer traffic jams, cheaper childcare, a handful of publicly owned grocery stores. This is not revolutionary. But the thing is that radicalism isn't a problem. The undoability of policies you propose is. And that's where I want to land. When campaigns fail to translate into governance, trust erodes. And what erodes isn't just trust in the leader, but trust in the entirety of the political process, and indeed even trust in the very difference between truth and lies. And earlier this century, we saw a particularly powerful example of Barack Obama, which showed us how far brilliance in communication can coexist with paralysis in office. So Mamdani's sincere agenda will collide with the limits of governance. And a lot of what he proposes may come to look hollow. Much of what he wishes to do will prove to be either out of his hands or not affordable or counterproductive or dependent on infrastructure that doesn't exist. And this is a paradox of modern democracy, that in 2025, our democracies which are in decline need bold action to survive, but are designed to smother bold action, if not make it entirely impossible. That's one of the thorny challenges that we face in the West in the 2020s and the 2030s, that to keep our democracy, we've got to be bold, but the ill-assorted mess of checks and balances in our democracies actually largely prevents the bold action that we need for democratic survival. Now, how far Mamdani's governance erodes trust will in part depend on whether he can persuade his political subjects that he is desperately and non-self-indulgently trying to make their lives better. So that clear perception of non-self-obsessed trying will be a very important factor here, as much of the campaign runs into the challenges of governance. Lots of love and talk very soon.